Almost 6 years ago, Jeb would announce and release the first of a series of special Minecraft versions, aiming to rectify and finally bridge the gap between the Minecraft community created by 1.9, the most controversial update in Minecraft history. Players were eager in anticipation of what Jeb had to offer. These versions have some unique game mechanics not present anywhere else. But now, over 4.5 years later, Minecraft's Combat Snapshots have seemingly been entirely abandoned. What went wrong? What do Minecraft developers think of combat behind the scenes? Have they been giving us hints about combat changes? Will Minecraft ever receive a combat update? Well, let's find out. But first, what were the main changes in the Combat Snapshots? First of all, attack reach was added as a new mechanic, and rather than just being 3 blocks globally, it now influenced how far certain weapons could reach. Swords could reach moderately far at 3 blocks, axes shorter at 2 blocks, and hoes and tridents the furthest at 3.5 blocks. Furthermore, charged attacks no longer gave bonus damage as they do now, instead allowing you to reach 1 block further. So, for example, performing a charged attack with a sword will give you 4 blocks of reach, rather than its usual 3. The attack speed for swords was also made faster, with the attack cooldown being reduced from 0.625 seconds to 0.33 seconds, now closer to the 1.8 attack speed. You could hold left click to attack, and rather than non-charged attacks being useless as they are today, non-charged or spam attacks still dealt significant damage and as such were a viable form of PvP again, same as they were back in 1.8. Axes got an attack speed increase too, but also got a damage nerf, able to disable shields and apply the sweeping edge effect, which swords no longer did by the way if they weren't enchanted. Axes also got a new enchantment called Cleaving, which increases damage and the duration of time shields are deactivated for. Shields also auto-activated upon sneaking now, allowing for the ability to block with a shield and attack at the same time. Outside of weapons and combat mechanics, a variety of other game mechanics and items were also changed. Normal potions can be stacked up to 16, bows become less accurate the longer you hold them, crossbows are stronger as the entity invulnerability timer is no longer triggered by projectiles, meaning multiple arrows can hit and deal damage to an entity at the same time. Eating and drinking can now be interrupted by taking damage, and entities can be attacked through tall grass. Overall, these PvP changes were aimed at speeding up PvP again, making it more similar to 1.8 PvP, whilst also not being too different from the current modern combat system. Jeb was clearly trying to find a middle ground between the best of both PvP systems and create a form of PvP that both would be satisfied with. And overall, many of these changes were well received. Jeb's Reddit post where he would release these snapshots to the public for testing saw widespread support. While some changes such as the auto-attacking and shield mechanics weren't as liked, the player base was very happy that after years, the combat divide was finally going to be answered. Throughout 2019 and early 2020, Jeb would release a variety of these combat test snapshots, getting feedback from the community each time. But in August of 2020, with the release of Minecraft Combat Test 8C, the 12th and final combat test snapshot, we haven't received one since. It has now been about 4.5 years since the last combat test snapshot. What happened? Well, that was the big question, and at first, many players part of the small but active Combat Snapshot communities, as well as myself, weren't too concerned. You see, in August of 2020, Minecraft's biggest ever update at the time was in development, 1.17, which now famously had to be split into multiple updates due to the insane number of features promised, with some content not being added to the game until years later. As such, many players simply believed that Jeb as well as the devs were busy with those updates and the combat test snapshots were put on a temporary hold. But as the years continued on, with the remnants of 1.17 added to the game and completed, players continued wondering what was going to happen. Some information would come out in 2022 from Minecraft devs, confirming that the gameplay design team would be taking over the combat snapshots from Jeb. This seemed promising at first, with the new team seemingly excited to work on it, but no ETA was given on when such development would begin. Again, not long after in 2022, Jeb would respond to a member of the combat test snapshot community on Twitter, confirming there wouldn't be any new combat tests soon, but continued engaging with the community regardless, still demonstrating interest in it. Then, for the remainder of 2022 and most of 2023, there was virtually no word on the combat snapshots. By late 2023, with the release of 1.20, the combat snapshots still on 1.16 were now 4 major versions outdated and players were getting worried. However, in Minecraft Live 2023, where the trial chambers from 1.21 were announced, an update clearly centered centered around PvE and exploration, Agnes did mention combat being the focus of the update a few times.
And in the recent years, we focus a lot on creativity and exploration. So for this year, it's time to focus more on combat adventures.
A big part of this update is that we really want to add new adventures for our more combat-loving players.
This was a reach at best though, and King B-Dogs, another Minecraft developer, would mention a few days later that this update, referring to 1.21, was definitely a PvE update, not a PvP update, and that players will be disappointed if they expected big combat changes. He mentions that PvP is not something that the team were focusing on currently, and also mentions how PvP is complicated and needs a lot of work. Pretty bad news all round, as the slight ray of hope players received was immediately crushed. He also mentioned earlier last year that he wouldn't personally design combat for 1.8 players, which was one of the main reasons the Combat Snapshots began in the first place. Even more concerning. Be sure to subscribe, by the way, so we can reach 800k subs, no pressure. A few months later, King B-Dogs would comment more, mentioning that the changes in the Combat Snapshot haven't had enough testing yet, especially with PvE, and that the Combat Snapshots would really need to be dug into in order to find out if they are in fact suitable for the game. He goes on to mention that more long-term planning needs to be done, with proper direction decided on for a future combat update, of which the design team hasn't had a chance to explore yet. He also says that he believes there aren't enough interesting elements in Minecraft PvP to be competitively viable, but he also says that the PvE experience could do with a combat overhaul. It seems like overall, King B-Dogs mentions that the Combat Snapshots were designed with PvP in mind over PvE, and properly adopting this system to the game would require extensive work to balance it around PvE and ensure the system is functional long term. More time passed without any information. However, only a few months ago in October, YouTuber IBXToyCat discovered a German interview with Agnes, the vanilla Minecraft game director, which when translated provided some interesting information. Specifically, Agnes was asked about how she decided what to add to the game, and her response was, "We look at what players want and what we have changed recently. While we added new types of caves and forests to the game last year, we will focus on other things for now, such as the combat system." This response seemed to strongly suggest that the combat system was being worked on, and gave players a lot of hope. That being said, it may not be as it seems. As comments on videos about this article pointed out, the translation may not have been super accurate, losing some nuance and context, with combat instead being an example of a change rather than an explicit statement on what was being worked on. Furthermore, as we just saw, Agnes has mentioned combat before in relation to Minecraft updates, referring to combat experiences such as the Troll Chamber, rather than the actual combat mechanics themselves. She could have been talking about focusing on more combat experiences once again, but that was lost in translation. Now, whilst there are doubts, some native German speakers within the Combat Snapshot community still believe that the combat system was being referred to specifically, but no word has been given since, so we can't tell for sure. Speaking of the combat test community, I covered them in my combat test video 2.5 years ago now, and despite being small, they had a community of active players who enjoyed the combat snapshots and ran servers using it, developing PvP strategies and minigames. Unfortunately, both servers shown in that video have since shut down, and there now is only one active combat test server named Nexia left, which sees around 5 to 10 players maximum per week, and a few smaller community run events. Unfortunately, it seems that now going on 4.5 years with no changes and very little information, most of the community who liked the combat snapshots has either moved on or lost hope in Mojang ever continuing them. So why? Why were the combat snapshots seemingly abandoned? Well, we can make some educated guesses based on information. My first theory is related to 1.8 PvP specifically. As King B-Dogs mentioned, he doesn't seem to think trying to appease 1.8 PvPers is a good idea. Remember, one of the main reasons the combat snapshots were released by Jeb back in 2019 was to bridge the divide. Back in 2019, 1.8 PvP was still for the most part considered the most popular form of PvP, and certainly had the most players, with 1.8 PvP and minigame servers still dominating the multiplayer scene. However, as time has continued on, nowadays 1.8 PvP is no longer nearly as popular as it once was, with only certain servers still running it successfully, and excluding Hypixel, modern PvP is easily more popular on servers now. Considering that players finally moved on after over 10 years, maybe the developers saw less and less reason to continue working on bridging the divide in combat, when that divide is now not nearly as notable. King B-Dog's messages do seem to be consistent with that. Another reason why the combat tests may have been abandoned is because they are also currently incompatible with another one of the developers' goals, game parity. For a while, parity between gameplay features and mechanics on both Bedrock and Java has been stated to be one thing Mojang are working on. And if you didn't know, many of the combat mechanics on Bedrock were never updated as they were on Java, speculated to be because the controls on Bedrock versions such as Pocket Edition would be awkward with them. The combat snapshot mechanics were only on Java and still utilized many game mechanics such as weapon cooldown, sweeping edge and more, which Bedrock does not have. As such, adding the new combat test to Bedrock may not be feasible or possible for now, and Mojang do not want to change combat mechanics yet again without Bedrock's combat also changing too. There's also the fact that the combat snapshots are very outdated now. The latest one is still on 1.16, and new mechanics and items such as the mace have since been added, which will need to be integrated into the combat snapshot system. Some people speculate that it may have to be recoded or changed to work with the new experiments tab Minecraft now uses to test features. It's likely that as more time passes, the time and effort required to bring back the combat snapshots, updating them and balancing them with the newest versions will only increase, and thus the chance of Mojang returning to working on them will only continue to decrease. An entirely different theory though, one which some members of the combat test community also seem to agree with, is that a combat overhaul is coming, but it won't be using the combat snapshots. As many of King B-Dog's comments seem to indicate, the combat snapshots need a lot more work before they are adopted, as they need to take the PvE combat experience into account. So it seems that maybe an entirely different combat system may eventually be worked on, leaving the combat test snapshots behind for good. And I honestly think that this is the most plausible explanation for why the combat snapshots were abandoned. The combat snapshot community has decided to take matters into their own hands though, and are now working on plugins for modern Minecraft servers which bring the combat snapshots to newer versions. Effectively, they plan to run a Minecraft server on the newest version, with server-side plugins recreating the changes from the combat snapshot. This could end up working really well, as it allows anybody to play the combat snapshots without having to use an outdated version of the game, or play on some tiny server, and this may even allow bigger servers to create game modes utilizing these combat changes. Links for their community are down below. But as it stands right now, it seems the combat snapshots are an update Minecraft may never receive. I hope you all enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, thank you all so much for watching.